But you can see from the relatively crooked and narrow streets of the city of Rome as they look from above today, you can see that, again, the city grew in a fairly ad hoc way, as I mentioned. It wasn't planned all at once. It just grew up over time, beginning in the 8th century BC. Now, this is interesting, because what we know about the Romans is when they left to their own devices and they could build the city from scratch, they didn't let it grow in an ad hoc way. They structured it in a very methodical way. That was basically based on military strategy and military planning. The Romans, they couldn't have conquered the world without obviously having a masterful military enterprise. And they were everywhere. They went on their various campaigns, their various military campaigns. They would build camps, and these camps were always laid out in a very geometrical plan along a grid, usually square or rectangular. We normally see blogging as a two-way interaction in which the blogger or author creates the content and the readers interact with or challenge the author. But the case will be much more difficult when it comes to governments, such as the White House, because people will become coarser and ruder online towards their governments, especially in the comment areas. Thus, governments' blogs may go wild and chaotic. And then governments will have to administrate the comments. Once the government starts to impose harsh administration on comment areas, citizens may find the government manipulating what should be said and what should be shown, which contradicts the original intention.
I think with our linguistic training, we are also get all this invisible training to be authorities, to be the people who know. It is part of that process that you come out as a world authority on your chosen subject. But when we move into working with communities, we have to recognize that communities have to be the authority in their language. Actually, a woman in the class I'm teaching at Sydney at the moment, a career woman, expressed this very nicely. Although she was talking about something else, she was distinguishing expertise from authority. And certain linguists, because of our training, we have expertise in certain very narrow areas of language. But we don't have the authority over what to do with that knowledge or what to do with our knowledge that the community produces. I guess for me, the bottom line is languages are lost because of the dominance of one people over another. That's not rocket science. That's not hard to work out. But then what that means is in working with language revival, we continue to hold the authority. We actually haven't done anything towards undoing how languages are lost in the first place. So in a sense, the languages are still lost if the authority is still lost.
Let's say if I'm asking which source you often use to get information, newspaper, radio, TV, and the survey shows 62% of the people chose internet. You might be thinking I am going to say how important the internet is, or how quickly it has changed the world for a few years. But what if I tell you this survey is conducted on the website globeandmail.com? Our answer will be different because the people who did this survey on a website must be frequent users of internet. This sample is a biased sample, so we have to pay attention to how a survey is conducted.
Absolutely. There's a lot of interest in what forms those clouds. Why are those clouds there? Why do they stick around? At the center of every cloud drop is a particle. You can't grow a cloud drop without having a particle there for the water to condense on. The key questions that people have not directly addressed until very recently is what actually forms those clouds. And so the ones that you're looking at over the ocean, it turns out sea salt is a very effective nucleator for forming clouds. So there's a really good chance that those are loaded with sea salt. But as you go inland, you start to have pollution come from all different kinds of sources. And so different sources form clouds more effectively than others. And we're trying to unravel which sources are actually contributing to the clouds. The clouds are incredibly important players in climate change, in that they reflect the light back to space. And so they're keeping things much, much cooler than they would be if they weren't there. They also play a huge role in regional weather. So we're actually starting to see shifts where having more pollution input into the clouds is affecting weather patterns. And in particular, it's actually reducing the amount of precipitation. So we're starting to see drought in areas with super high levels of air pollution.
Why is it difficult to make a robot like a human being?
Why can't robots finish the work easily like human beings? For some tasks, it is easy and simple for humans to complete, but it is very difficult to ask a robot to do what we want because humans and robots have different recognition functions. For example, considering the insights, it is hard for robots to recognize colors because they do not have sensory mechanisms. Artificial intelligence scientists have to devise a sensor that is implanted to robots to enable them to recognize different colors. The sensor has a camera on it to capture pixels, and then will translate the pixels into an image, which is not as easy as expected. This process is very complex. The translation of every pixel to accurate things could be difficult, especially color differentiation, which needs complicated sensors to fulfill. So the improvement of the sensor is necessary. In conclusion, there is no comparison between humans and robots.
But Aristotle says the reason we need rhetoric is we have to be able to use it. To use rhetoric influence the ramble. We try to get them to understand truth. Truth is suggest, is different than rhetoric. Rhetoric is the dressing, is the body, right? Truth is the spirit, is the soul, is abstract. It doesn't have a body. It's not particular. If you want to get somebody to the truth, you might have to use some kind of tricks, right? Because most of people are not sound and can see the truth. That's what we think. Most people are rambles, really. Only the educated, be erudite, are actually capable of seeing the truth. If you want to get the general mass there, you may have to do a little bit. So Aristotle, that is rhetoric. Rhetoric is something that is used to influence people, right? And it's kind of mentally promised a logic.
Happiness comes from frequency and quality of social relation. The higher the frequency is, the more happiness relations with friends and family and others produce. It is not sure why social relation is correlated with happiness, but there's evidence that when people feel more satisfied with their social relations, they will feel happier. In turn, when people feel happier, they will get more satisfied with social relations. Happy people tend to be more social with friends and have more interaction between family. Some people wonder if their social activities make them happier, or their happy personalities drive them to be more social more with their friends and family.
Female. Which one of you are going to write more in your book, science or scientists? Male. I do want very much to write something about science, actually, so I prefer to scientists. Female. All right. What's interesting in scientists, then? Male. Science is just like complex furniture, which is all about evidence. But scientists can tell stories, do researches, and propose questions to find what is true. They are like a focal point. They are always in interesting situations. Female. Whether science or scientists your book mainly about, it seems to be rather hard for general readers to understand, doesn't it? Male. I don't think so, really. In fact, the book I write in a science fiction, which is related with science but is not strictly scientific. So you don't have to have a PhD degree in physics or other disciplines to understand a science fiction. And loving science is very different from being a scientist, which means fiction writing is not the same as writing scientific journals. When scientists fail, they will question the situation about why they have failed. But as a fiction writer, I don't have to. In my book, you can always see stories about happy family.
Traffic light colors, red, amber, and green, are used to indicate food's nutritional values according to a healthy standard. Different colors represent different food types, so that people can determine what to eat and when they need some certain types of nutrient. The responsibility to label food properly on the packages is on the retailers. Thus, consumers can be aware of food with less salt or less fat. This system makes it easier for consumers to make decisions.
The sound of a cracking knee isn't particularly pleasant, but it gets worse when you listen up close.
It does for most people, but for me, it actually just makes me excited.
Omar Inan, an electrical engineer at Georgia Tech.
I actually feel like there's some real information in them that can be exploited for the purposes of helping people with rehab.
Enon's experience with cracking knees goes back to his days as an undergrad at Stanford, where he threw discus.
If I had a really hard workout, then the next day, of course, I'd be sore. But I would also sometimes feel that I would feel this basically catching or popping or creaking every now and then in my knee.
A few years later, he found himself building tiny microphones at a high-end audio company. So when he got to Georgia Tech and heard the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA, wanted better tech for knee injuries, he thought, why not strap tiny microphones to people's knees to eavesdrop as their legs bend?
What we think it is the cartilage and bone rubbing against each other, the surfaces inside the knee rubbing against each other during those movements.
He and a team of physiologists and engineers built a prototype with stretchy athletic tape and a few tiny mics and skin sensors. And preliminary tests on athletes suggest the squishy sounds the device picks up are more erratic and more irregular in an injured knee than in a healthy one, which Enon says might allow patients and doctors to track healing after surgery. Details appear in the IEEE transactions on biomedical engineering.
The primary application we're targeting at first is to give people a decision aid during rehabilitation following an acute knee injury to help them understand when they can perform particular activities and when they can move to different intensities of particular activities.
A useful thing to take a crack at.
I've been thinking a lot about the world recently and how it's changed over the last 20, 30, 40 years. 20 or 30 years ago, if a chicken caught a cold and sneezed and died in a remote village in East Asia, it would have been a tragedy for the chicken and its closest relatives, but I don't think there was much possibility of us fearing a global pandemic and the deaths of millions. 20 or 30 years ago, if a bank in North America lent too much money to some people who couldn't afford to pay it back, and the bank went bust, that was bad for the lender and bad for the borrower, but we didn't imagine it would bring the global economic system to its knees for nearly a decade. This is globalization. This is the miracle that has enabled us to transship our bodies and our minds and our words and our pictures and our ideas and our teaching and our learning around the planet ever faster and ever cheaper. It's brought a lot of bad stuff, like the stuff that I just described, but it's also brought a lot of good stuff. A lot of us are not aware of the extraordinary successes of the Millennium Development Goals, several of which have achieved their targets long before the due date. That proves that this species of humanity is capable of achieving extraordinary progress if it really acts together and it really tries hard. But
at the top, you would have a king. Now, the king would rule over a kingdom. Now, this is not so easy to govern, especially during the Middle Ages, and the king might owe many people things, especially people who helped the king come to power, helped him depose the previous king or to conquer this land. And so, in exchange for that, and to help govern, he might grant land or fiefs to other people. And the key currency in the Middle Ages under the feudal system is land, and land in exchange for loyalty and service. So this whole thing is a kingdom. Now right over here, this is a duchy. And a duchy will be controlled by a duke. I guess they didn't call it duchy because that just doesn't sound as serious. So the king might grant a duchy to a duke, and in exchange, the duke would provide loyalty, pledge their fealty. If the kingdom is threatened, the duke will fight alongside the king, would provide their own troops. If the king wants to go conquer other territories, same thing. And also provide the king with taxes, which might be in the form of coinage, depending on what time and region we are in the Middle Ages, or it might be in the form of a percentage of the agricultural production from this duchy.
Is a picture, sort of artist's impression before the space age of what Venus might be like on its surface. And so this was looking at the planet Venus. It was science fiction and science fact. all the way up to 56 before the start of the space age. But it wasn't completely disproved, this idea of a really sort of lush environment on Venus, until 1967, which is when the first measurements in detail were done at Venus. So Venera 4 and Mariner 5 confirmed the feeling from an earlier space mission that in fact the surface of Venus was not like this at all, but extremely hot, and also that the clouds were made of sulfuric acid, so there wasn't a nice water cycle like is going on in this picture. But it had to wait for these in situ measurements by a spacecraft to actually do that. And so Venus turned out not to be quite as Earth-like as we thought. And I'll sort of tell you about some of the latest results from Venus Express, which say actually there are some Earth-like features, but to a large extent it's not like the Earth.
There are many functional areas and services in the library. You'll see the service desk after entering the library, and you can have these services at the service desk. There are computers on each floor, by which you can gain access to the internet and check emails and library catalogs. Follow the orange signs and you will find printers. Then, follow the instructions to use them. Remember to bring student cards. You have to use printers with your card. If necessary, you can ask the staff at the front desk to help you.
Many parents communicate and educate their children with 2 languages, probably because they both know more than one language or they come from different countries. Most of these parents think this can benefit their children's language learning, but actually kids will get confused when their parents use different languages from each other to describe the same subject. If one parent sticks to one language and the other one sticks to another, their children will not be confused anymore.
The history of software is, of course, very, very new. The whole IT industry is really only 67 years old, which is extraordinary. To be so close to the birth of a major new technology, a major new discipline, is quite remarkable given where we've got to in those 67 years. And the progression has been not so much a progression as a stampede. Because Moore's law, the rapid expansion in the power of computing and the rapid fall of the cost of computing and storage and communications has made it feasible for information technology to move into all sorts of areas of life that were never originally envisaged. What has happened is that there has been, as I said, a stampede for people to pick the low-hanging fruit. And that is what's guided the development of software and information technology over the past decades, and continues to do so, with a number of consequences that we will explore.
Variation in frogs. Frogs are a diverse and largely carnivorous group of short-bodied, tailless amphibians, composing the order of Anura. The oldest fossil found of a frog appeared in the early Triassic of Madagascar, but molecular clock dating suggests that their origins may extend further back to the Permian. That's 265 million years ago. Frogs are widely distributed, ranging from the tropics to the subarctic regions, but the greatest concentration of species diversity is found in tropical rainforests. There are approximately 4,800 recorded species, accounting for over 85% of extant amphibian species. They are also one of the 5 most diverse vertebrate orders. Besides living in fresh water and on dry land, the adults of some species are adapted for living underground or in trees. Adult frogs generally have a carnivorous diet consisting of small invertebrates, but omnivorous species exist and a few feed on fruit. Frogs are extremely efficient at converting what they eat into body mass. They are an important food source for predators and part of the food web dynamics of many of the world's ecosystems. Their skin is semi-permeable, making them susceptible to dehydration. So they either live in moist places or have special adaptations to deal with the dry habitats. Frogs also produce a wide range of vocalizations, particularly when they are in breeding season, and exhibit many different kinds of complex behaviors to attract mates, to fend off predators, and to generally survive. Frog populations have shown significant decline since the 1950s. More than 1/3 of species are considered to be threatened with extinction, and over 120 are believed to have become extinct since the 1980s. The number of malformations among frogs is on the rise, and an emerging fungal disease, chytridiomycosis, has spread around the world. Conservation biologists are working to understand the causes of these problems and to resolve them. Frogs are valued as food by humans and also have many cultural roles in literature, symbolism, and religion.